Hey girls, it's Miss Fletcher. So before we go, I wanted to remind you of something that we do at St. Mary's that's so special and that I miss a lot. So I want to see if you can join in with me. We're going to sing This Little Light of Mine, okay? Ready? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Hide it under a bush.
Videos like this of Eliza Fletcher have been making the rounds across social media ever since she was declared missing and presumed kidnapped based on the video evidence. She has been described by members of her family and her friends as a light in their world, and the teacher and mother of two unfortunately was discovered dead, and we now have a suspect in custody. Cleotha Henderson is the man that Memphis police are currently saying is responsible for this abduction. Now, when a story like this cuts to the core of a community, when a story like this impacts so many people, terrifies that community, and you have a suspect, people begin in the era of woke prosecutors, woke criminal justice reform that goes soft on criminals, looking into this man's history to find out if there was anything that could predict this behavior in the future or anything that allowed this to happen when it shouldn't have. And what we're going to talk about today is how sometimes we can't do anything about a particular suspect. Sometimes the system is harsh, it is cruel, and even when somebody has a pattern of behavior, in reality, there are limitations to what we can achieve, and I'm going to go over and refute some of the claims about this person being released early or treated soft by the criminal justice system, while simultaneously explaining that yes, he had a pattern of behavior, and I'll talk about the additional charge that he received after being arrested in the Fletcher case. However, this video is sponsored. I don't feel like the subject matter lends itself to a goofy transition, so we will go into the sponsor read, and then we'll come back and discuss this situation on the other side. Noble Gold CEO Colin Bloom believes that the quantitative tightening that we're seeing from the Fed is actually setting the stage for a gold rally. Sure, in the short term, this will increase the power of the dollar. However, by the time we get around to next year, the Fed is going to want to restart the economy, and the only method that they have is printing more money and injecting it into the system. This means you better be hanging on to something that is hedging against the value of the dollar. Now, if you're thinking about gold and silver as your hedge, I definitely recommend you go over to noblegoldinvestments.com, or you call and talk to one of their experts at 877-646-5347, and if you decide to set up a qualifying IRA or 401k with them, you will be gifted an American Eagle 1/10 of an ounce gold coin. That's 877-646-5347 or noblegoldinvestments.com. So on September 2nd, Eliza Fletcher went on her normal morning run, as she typically did, where she unfortunately encountered Henderson. Now, Henderson had been released from prison. He served about 20 years on a 24-year sentence that involved a kidnapping, and he has a lengthy criminal history behind that. Now, of course, Henderson, being the monster that he absolutely is, forced the mother of two, forced the teacher into his SUV, and she was never seen alive again by anybody except for Henderson. In fact, her body was dumped in a community known for blight, known as a bad area, and the manhunt was on for the man responsible, which of course turned out to be him, allegedly. He's not convicted yet. Now, a lot of people talked about his release from prison at 20 years of a 24-year sentence, and there was actually a lot of misinformation about him being paroled, but in reality, in actuality, that is not the case. You see, what happened with Henderson is that he served a pretty damn good portion of his sentence. In fact, in most states with the strictest truth in sentencing rules, he served far beyond what you would expect. 20 years on a 24-year bid is over 80% of that sentence. However, there is some other things that weren't being accounted for, because a lot of people have zeroed in on the date that he was convicted of the crime and started the clock from there. However, it turns out that Henderson was actually held in jail through the entirety of the prosecution pre-trial, which lasted about 512 days. Now, we've talked about how in California, you actually get double time, double credit for that time. However, even in a system where you don't get double time, 512 days is very close to 2 years. So this guy got some credit for his pretrial detainment, which makes sense because he was serving in prison, or in the county jail to be more accurate, while he was awaiting trial. So to the extent that he was released early by the standards of the other states, it's actually just not the case. This is typically a very strict interpretation of a very strict sentence. And there were allegations that he got parole, that he was just let out by this woke parole board, whatever, things that we've seen before. But in reality, he was not eligible for parole. The state of Tennessee actually did their job in this instance. Normally, they would say that you would be eligible for parole after 2/3, after half, after 85% of your sentence, or whatever, but in this specific case, they mandated that this man serve 100% of his time due to his past criminal history. And we have to go into this because it's actually unbelievable how many crimes this 38-year-old man committed before the crime that landed him in jail. And by the way, the one that he committed that landed him in prison for that 20 years, he was doing while he was 18. So all of these crimes that I'm going to go over are crimes that he was committed while he was a minor. So Henderson's juvenile record had 5 charges of aggravated assault and a rape charge by the time that he was 14. 14 years old, this guy had 5 serious assault charges. Aggravated assault, it's so close to attempted murder. We often see plea exchanges on attempted murder down to aggravated assault and a rape charge. And when he committed the crime of pointing a gun at an attorney and kidnapping that attorney, he was actually 16 years old. So I know I said he was in jail or he committed the crime when he was 18. That's actually not the case. He was finally convicted when he turned 18, but he actually committed the crime that landed him in prison for 20 years of his life when he was 16. This guy had a violent, repeated criminal history, and the judge threw the book at him. He looked at his past juvenile record. He said, enough is enough. You've been given 1,000,000 chances in the world, and you must serve 100% of his sentence. So what ultimately ended up happening when we're discussing this case? Because he's 38 years old, and he's been released, and he was sent in when he was 18. Well, obviously, we have the 2 or so years that were credited to him while he was in jail awaiting trial as a 16 to an 18-year-old. But there's actually a little bit more to the story, because also in prison, you end up with a system where you can get credits for behavior that will shave off a little bit of time here and there. And during the course of his 20 years, according to the Department of Corrections in Tennessee, he actually earned the credits that got him that time. And apparently in prison, if you're doing bad behavior, if you're committing crimes and all of that, those credits can be wiped away very easily. And the maximum that you can earn in Tennessee is about 6 or 7 credits a month. Like, not that many, and considering he was there for 20 years and he only needed credits to shave off about a year and a half or so, this really means that their system is incredibly strict and incredibly harsh in the state of Tennessee. Now, Henderson, despite what was originally reported by the Shelby County District Attorney, never received a parole hearing. In fact, the parole board was so outraged by the idea that they were getting the blame for this guy being let out, because they strongly recommended, even with his credits, that he not be let out of prison, that they were talking about defamation claims against the district attorney, and the district attorney had to issue an apology on Twitter for saying that they were released due to the parole board. And in reality, it's because the parole board is 100% accurate. He was not paroled in any way, shape, or form. He served out his time according to Tennessee law, and the way that the Tennessee law was structured in this instance made his sentence harsher than we will ever see in almost any case in the United States of America. So what we have in this case is a tragedy, but a tragedy that, according to Tennessee law, was not preventable by the parole board, was not preventable by the district attorney, was not preventable by the Department of Corrections, because the laws are guided specifically by the Tennessee legislature, and they made it absolutely clear that offenders like this had to serve their time in the manner that was described, and over everyone's objections, because people did not trust this individual, he had to be released. And this wasn't a parole release, this was a straight up release. And it's actually kind of even more wild than you would imagine, because it turns out the other day, news just broke that this man, Henderson, this lifetime criminal, this guy who spent 20 years in lockup, this person who killed Eliza Fletcher, is actually facing additional charges of kidnapping and rape. And before you think that was attached to Fletcher, even though we know for sure he definitely kidnapped her at this point in time, you would be wrong. Those charges are completely unrelated. He actually reoffended another time during the period of time that he was released. On top of that, they actually raided his house post him being arrested, and they ended up arresting his brother, who is also a career criminal, because he's also a fentanyl dealer, and he had a bunch of guns and weaponry and all kinds of illegal stuff. So what we're seeing is a criminal cycle that keeps repeating, but in reality, there was no real way to prevent this situation from occurring, except for maybe if Fletcher was armed and ready for somebody to approach her. Look, I'd love to attack the system. I'd love to attack the officials. I would love if a Shaun King elected, George Soros-backed district attorney were in place in Memphis that I could point the finger at, but in reality, it's just not the case in this instance. This is an example of the limitations of what we can design as people trying to intervene and trying to solve the problems of crime. This is an example of all of the systems working to identify a dangerous person, punish that person to the fullest extent of the law, and that not preventing that person from actually going out and committing crimes. So while on paper, if you count 24 years from the time that this person was convicted, on paper, if you count 24 years from the time that this person was arrested, you could say that they did not serve their time in prison. In reality, according to Tennessee law, they 100% did. In reality, according to everything related to the system, there was no failure. He earned his little petty credits over the course of its 20 years. He got the 512 days time served credited to him for when he was in jail awaiting trial, which, by the way, a lot of people are saying they should get rid of that. No, they definitely shouldn't. The fact that you get credit for that is totally fine in my opinion, because the point is you're trying to serve out your sentence. If you just say that's free time for the government to hold you awaiting trial, then that's no benefit at all to the defendant, and we do have to have some presumption of innocence and some rights for the defendant, and I think that would be a total violation of those rights, in my humble opinion. But this is one of those cases that are always going to slip through the cracks. This is one of those cases that are just not going to work out the way that we want, and legislative fixes aren't actually going to be there. And by the way, I just want to address people who were saying that she was out jogging way too early in the morning, it was dark out, therefore it was dangerous, whatever. You have to realize that we're in the state of Tennessee. We're talking about Memphis. It is unbelievably hot during the daytime at that time. So the fact of the matter is, it is not unusual for people who run, for people who jog, for people who want to exercise outdoors to do so in the twilight, in the evening, or in the early pre-dawn to dawn hours. So the idea that we're going to shift the blame to Eliza Fletcher for what this criminal did to her, for what this monster who should be in prison for the rest of his life, and honestly face the death penalty if Tennessee is willing to push for it, did, is absurd in my opinion. This man is responsible. Henderson, he committed the crime. He needs to suffer the consequences for it. Nobody else can be blamed. This isn't a systemic failure. This isn't a failure of our institutions. This isn't a woke prosecutor who just cut him a break he didn't deserve. This is his actions, despite the fact that he's been punished repeatedly for the crimes that he committed. This man is the man at fault in this case, and we should accept no substitutions, no deflections, no changes of the subject, other than holding this man accountable. And if you want to give any advice to people out there in the world, especially young women, especially women going for jogs when it's early dawn or twilight hours or whenever, it's to carry a firearm. If you live in a state like Tennessee that has good firearm laws that advantage law-abiding citizens, then you need to exercise your right, because in reality, there was nothing that could have been done to prevent this man from getting out of prison and committing the crime that he committed. You could only punish him for what you can prove. They punished him to the fullest extent of the law for what they could have proved against him back in the day. He was out. It turns out not rehabilitated at all. Turns out this is one of those ultra predators, super predators, whatever you want to call them. This guy was a problem, and he was going to reoffend again, and it turns out he reoffended 2 times that we know of again as soon as he was released. So I send my condolences to the Fletcher family, not only for their loss, but for the eventuality of Kim Kardashian trying to defend the person that killed their loved one, to her husband, to her children, to everybody in the community that was affected by this. We are sorry. We want things to be better. We want to go after the criminals, but sometimes there are limitations. And like I said, without assigning any blame to Eliza Fletcher, the lesson in this really is that you are responsible for your own safety in the end. Because even when the system works, even when it functions as intended, even when it's harsh on crime, that doesn't necessarily mean that the threat is neutralized forever. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like the video, you can show them by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can follow me on all my social media. You can support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the tragedy that was the Eliza Fletcher case. Till next time.